Welcome back to Database DevOps from start to finish. This is the Additional Features section, where we look at what else SQL Server data tools can do. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how to run SQL scripts before and after we deploy our database. All right, so let's go to Visual Studio, and we're going to work in the person DB. I'm going to collapse down DBO, and instead I'm going to right-click on the main project and say Add Folder, and let's just call this Scripts. We could do, let's do a pre-deploy, a pre-scripts, and a post-scripts. That way we're very clear as to which script is which. So post-scripts as well. Now we're only going to actually build a post-script. We're not going to create a pre-script, but we have the option for either of these, or actually two more kinds as well. We're going to look at all four kinds. So sometimes when you are deploying your database application, you may want to either do some cleanup before you deploy your changes to the database, or maybe you want to do some work after you deploy your changes. One example might be that you want to make sure that your location list has something in it. So we have our table, we have our locations. Maybe you want to have a couple of locations in that table all the time. So even a fresh database has these locations. More often, this is used for things like options. Maybe you have a day of week table. Probably not, but maybe you do, where you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So there would be no reason not to have that table populated when your database is fresh. There's no reason to give the user options to add to that table or remove from that table. You just want to put the data in there. What you can do is create a post-deployment script that we run after you have deployed your database that will make sure that those records are in that table. In our case, we're going to make sure that we have a few points of interest in our locations table when it gets deployed. So let's right-click on Post Scripts. These folders do not matter. They do not determine whether it's a pre-script or a post-script. Instead, we're just using these to differentiate visually in our project tree. So right-click and say Add Script. And we get the option of the four different script types. We have post-deployment, which happens after you deploy the database. We have pre-deployment, which happens before you deploy the database. So in the deployment process, maybe you want to delete out a table and clear it out, and so there's no records in that table before you actually deploy your changes. Well, that would be a pre-deployment script. There's also the concept of a build script. And this is a script that will get put in the build. It's not necessarily doesn't have a place necessarily as far as it happens here versus there. It just happens in that build somewhere. And then we also have a script that's not in the build. This would be for something where you want to have it referenced with your database, but not necessarily deployed with your database. So in this case, we're going to do a post-deployment script. And we could name it script.postdeployment1, but let's just call this the populate locations.sql. We hit OK. And this is a post-deployment script. How do we know it's a post-deployment script? Well, if we right-click and go to Properties, we can see that the build action is post-deploy versus pre-deploy versus build versus none. Okay, that's why I put these into folders, because unless you name them post-deploy populate locations, you can't really tell visually that this is a post-deployment script. So I put it into a folder so I know, okay, these are the ones that are post-deployment. If I were to change this to a pre-deployment, I would move this to the pre-scripts folder. Now this script gets run every time after we deploy our database. Remember, our database gets deployed multiple times as we change it. Therefore, you have to make sure your script that you write is capable of safely running more than once. Now, there are options here for using SQL command statements. So for things like variables that you can use in your scripts if you want to use them. In this case, I'm going to create a very simple insert statement. So I'm going to say insert into DBO dot, notice I have IntelliSense here, locations. I'm going to have my locations, which is my point of interest and my location itself, which has to be in square brackets, or should be. And then values, I'm going to put in a couple different values. So it's just 2 string fields, so that's good enough for now. So let's add in a location of the Empire State Building, and that is in New York. Wow, New York City, New York. That's 1. And then I'm going to let's put at least 1 more. Let's go with Mount Rushmore. So Mount Rushmore, and this is in South Dakota. It's technically in Keystone, South Dakota. I actually had to look that up because I didn't know the city it was in. So if I run this script every time I deploy, it's going to add these 2 records over and over and over again, and soon we'll have multiples of each of these. And that's not ideal. Now, there's a couple ways I could get around this. One would be, let's create an if statement up here, and then we'll put it inside once we have the right if statement. So if, and I can do a select 1 from dbo.locations, and actually that should be a if exists. So if exists, select 1 from dbo.locations, meaning are there any records at all? Then I can do a begin and end, and I can say if not exists, and then I can put my code, my statement in here, and now this will only get run, this insert statement, if there are no records in the dbo.locations table, none at all. And that might work. Or I could be even more specific and say where the point of interest equals, and have the Empire State Building, or point of interest equals, and have Mount Rushmore. And then it'll make sure that those 2 don't exist. So you can have records in the locations table, but if those records, let's get some spacing here. If those records don't match the ones that we're adding, then make sure to add those. So as long as you don't have either of these, then go ahead and insert. Okay? Either way will work. It's up to you how you want to do this, or do something totally different. But now I have a post-deployment script. So let's close this out, and I am going to commit this, which will allow us to go through that process of build and deploy. So let's go back to our changes. Let's make sure everything is saved. We're going to add just the changes that we want, not that schema compare. I really need to add that to the ignore list. I'll get there. But this is add post deploy script. Adds records to the location table on deployment. And I'm going to sync those changes. So once that sync is done, it will send the information out to Azure DevOps. So let's bring Azure DevOps back up here. We can see that the commit, the add post deploy script, is on the server. And if we look, the status actually has a play button next to it, meaning it's in progress. If we go to pipelines, we can see that, in fact, yes, this is currently deploying. And if we look, it's currently checking out the solution and running our build for this. Once this is done, it will move on to the release stage. Okay, it's just finishing up. It's done. So now we've got a completed build. If we go to releases, we should see that a new release has kicked off, and that's right here. That's release number 2. So let's look at this, and it's currently queued. So we can watch once it connects, it will start doing the process of deploying this to our Azure SQL Server. So it started the process. Now it's getting the drop file, and it's now deploying to Azure. Now this can take a little bit of time or a lot of time, but part of the reason why is because we're using the build agent right on Azure DevOps. It's the one that they provide. And the reason why that can take a little bit of time or a lot of time is because it's not dedicated to you. You get it in turn in sequence, but sometimes you have to wait a little bit on it, and it is rebuilding from scratch all of your information. If you decide to have a local build agent or a build agent of your own, a private one, it can do some caching and some other things to be able to do this deployment in a more efficient manner. So you will see some performance gains if you use a private build client. Okay, so that is starting. It shouldn't take too long, but once that's done, we'll be able to look at what we've got. We'll hit refresh to make sure that it's still in progress, and it is. Okay, so I paused the video and started back up once it was complete, which it took 3 minutes and 46 seconds. Not too bad, just not something you want to watch run while I'm talking. So now we have this, we can come back over to our database, and a refresh here might be warranted if we did add anything, but let's look at the locations table. Remember, this is a fresh database we've never used, never put anything in. Select top 1,000 rows, and we'll see that we have 2 rows here, one for Empire State Building and one for Mount Rushmore. So that is what that build script, that post-deployment script did for us, is it added those 2 records for us. And if we run it again, it will not add it a second time. So that is what a post-deployment script is. A pre-deployment script is essentially the same thing. It's just that it runs before you do your deployment. So if you want to clear out a table or do other settings, it just provides you with options. Now you have options of different scripts you can add to your build process to do custom actions that might not be as simple as a create a table, create a store procedure, or create a view. It may require some more work to happen. And that's where your pre and post deployment scripts come into play.